everyone. Alrighty, let's go ahead and jump into our lecture for this week. So this one's actually going to be a short one. We only have one lecture we're going to do this week. Most weeks will probably be 2 or 3 where I'll split it up to try to give us more time. And so you have time to be able to digest it. But this one is just real easy material. So we're just going to go straight on through. Okay, so welcome to hospitality. So this week I'm going to tell you a little bit about the history of hospitality, where these sort of industries came from, a little bit about the service life philosophy, and then kind of contextualize where we're going from here. Okay, so hospitality, the word itself comes from hospice. And I'm not talking about like hospice care, where you might have your grandmother or your parents or your friends. Even though that is a type of care, right? But this basic word means to provide care or shelter. Typically for travelers, that's how it was originally meant in like the older French term, though in modern ways, it's more just to provide care or shelter. But this word hospitality means that we're essentially trying to give, right? And that's one of the coolest parts about this industry is it's really trying to provide the best for people. So thinking about it through time, a lot of our first recorded elements of thinking about providing travel and providing accommodations actually come from ancient Sumeria, which recorded the first elements of hospitality that were provided to locals. This is where we actually find the oldest evidence in the world from about 4200 BC. Well, oldest recorded evidence in some groups. There's a lot of stuff about like the history of the ancient Greeks and how there might have actually been fast food restaurants as early as like 5000 BC in different places. But we don't really have strong proof. Anyways, ancient Sumeria, they were providing traveling taverns, right? So travel during these times to go between country to country would take days. And especially when you were talking about places that had lots of different types of groups, lots of different types of kingdoms, lots of different types of political stability, where roads were not well designed or well established. Traveling took a long time. So having a place where travelers could have beer, food, and a place to stay really mattered. So between 4000 and 2000 BC, a lot of early civilizations started to grow some elements of these sort of like hospitality offerings. In the original sort of tavern and goods traditions, right? Where we started to have the idea of like dry goods stores and a place where people could sit down on their way. So moving more into the modern era, because I'm not going to bother you too much with way too much information I know about like ancient Greek travel places. Let's get a little bit closer to today with more of the medieval times. So in the medieval times, we started to have innkeepers in Florence and Italy that were run by guilds. And at the time, guilds were actually a lot of like professional associations and occupational licensing that we have today. They were groups of similar merchants or similar types of industries who would get together to make a conglomerate. And in this conglomerate, they would end up making rules for their industry, what people had to do to be able to enter it and stuff like that. And they would provide rules for the way that certain business should be conducted. The innkeepers had their own guilds as early as the 13th century. I can actually show you some pictures from paintings. Maybe I'll bring it up at one of the future recordings. But seeing these individuals just sort of sitting around and talking and thinking about what prices they should charge. At the time, there was a lot of like price fixing to have the prices be similar no matter where you were going or at different types of inns, right? They would also work together to understand what was required of an innkeeper. And this was important for if new people wanted to join the industry or open up their own stuff. Because for example, a stagecoach going from London to Bath, which were 2 different places, and I guess technically England, but now think about it as the United Kingdom. Longer story, because this took 3 days and had like several stopovers at different inns and taverns, we had to have things called post houses, places where people could stop, where they could rest and relax and sleep and be able to have social activities. So from there, we started to grow after the Dark Ages. We got to about the 16th century, which was actually about the beginning of the Pirate Age, by the way, which if you ever want to get into the history of pirates and hospitality, let me know, but I'm not going to bother you with this here because I don't want you to be bored. But we started to get to this point of coffee houses emerging as social centers. Now, this was newer to the European era, but had been around for a very long time in different parts of the Middle East and ancient China when we had different sorts of tea and tea houses, which were major social centers. centers. But about the 16th century, we saw the rise of modern coffee houses where you would go and instead of bringing your own cup with you, you would actually have cups that you were served from, and that you would have people who would make a show of making this coffee and performing the process of making this coffee for you. And these are places where people would gather. That's why a lot of the artists from this time period, the very few paintings that we still have that, okay, not very few, by very few, I mean few tens of thousands, which in the art world is actually very few. But we see a lot of scenes from this time period that were not of standing individuals or of places such as churches. They tended to also be around like coffee houses or social centers where we would see people interacting in an almost tavern-like environment. And this was where a lot of this like social nuance piece started to grow. This is where we started to see the beginning of how people held their forks and knives. We saw some of the beginning of dining etiquette starting in the early 1500s, and it's actually pretty neat stuff. Then we started to transition from the 1500s all the way over to the 1800s, right? Or excuse me, the 1700s, we're talking about the 18th century. At this point, we have colonies in the United States, which I'm going to talk a lot about North American settlements, and I'm going to talk a lot about North American hospitality, mostly because that's what I've been working in my entire life. And I know North American hospitality history a little bit better than other places. But the taverns were so important to the beginning of North American settlements. So, for example, George Washington used the Francis Tavern as sort of the Revolutionary War headquarters. At the time, they didn't have a White House, right? The White House wasn't around. It was a collection of individuals who got together, who very often talked about politics and taxes and diplomatic things and trade and insurance. Insurance was actually sold many times within a lot of these social settings. So these taverns, they were a peak area of where social and community activity was happening. And this is where a lot of the hospitality industry we have today started to grow out of. At the same time, the French Revolution was happening because, we had the beheading of, oh gosh, was it Louis the 14th or Louis the 16th? It was like Louis the 16th, whichever one was married to the woman who said, let them eat cake. But at this time in the French Revolution, because of a lot of food instabilities, there was a lot of changes in sort of this culinary history. Chefs started to move to other countries, both to leave the fact that there was changes in the political dynamics of France at the time. And many of these chefs had been employed by royal families while they started to move to other places all around the world. This is actually where we saw the disposition of French cooking and culinary arts, right? To the point where even Thomas Jefferson had a French chef in the White House. And this ended up greatly influencing food. Food was no longer, well, a lot of the time it was, you wouldn't go to the tavern just to have your gruel, right? You didn't go to the tavern just to have a pie or a piece of chicken. You started to go to some of the high-end taverns, to some of the places that were attached to some of the better social function areas. If anybody's gone to Colonial Williamsburg, this is where a lot of those taverns started to arise, where they were more similar to restaurants that we see today, where we started to have higher influence food trends, where we started to have like French chefs coming in showing culinary arts and then people imitating them and then starting to bring in other traditions and cultures. And then we started to have sort of the Instagram worthy food of the 1700s, right? And this is actually a game changer. People were no longer wanting to only eat within their home. They were moving to these social centers. And it wasn't only the affluent society. It was everybody from the low class, the middle class, the farmers, started to at least have some sort of social center in hospitality. And it was really neat to think about how this massive change has happened, and also how it has made differences in like food and tradition and culture able to be communicated. So there we go. Let's go into the 19th century. So then we get to about the 1800s, right? And then we have Antoine Quarry. I always struggle with the E with a little piece on top, but published one of the premier French cooking books, right? So we've had cookbooks. At this time, we have had hundreds of cookbooks, but a lot of the cookbooks were focused on, hey, here's some neat dishes that you could make, or hey, here is something that you could do if you need to be able to use this type of vegetable. This was one of the first books that was widely spread in its own time period that really taught about the basics of cooking, right? How do you make each sauce? Saying that there's each sauce, thinking about how to make it delectable, thinking about what the prime dishes are. It was really just sort of the first textbook almost of classic French cooking. And this really helped a lot of restaurants, right? Because restaurants now all of a sudden had a book that they could go to and learn how to make Alfredo sauce, learn how to make tomato sauce, learn how to make different types of masala, learn how to make all these different things from all over the world, because there was finally a reference book available from it. So this started off with a lot of the restaurants highly scaling up, getting a lot more common items in between different restaurants, but also having their own types of specializations. This is where we had different types of service coming in. So having someone who might lead you to your table, or having more of a waiter appear, or having listed prices and menus. This is where a lot of that really started to grow in a way that it hadn't before. Instead of it being posted on a wall, it was something that was handed to you. So from the 1800s, we start to get to the 1900s, right? And several restaurant chains began in the 1900s, many of the ones that you know today. When we get to hotel and lodging next week, and I go through a little bit of the history of hotel and lodging, you'll hear a lot about how the 1900s were really where we saw the spread of hotels, like formal hotels and hotel chains starting up. And with those also came a lot of restaurants that were tied to them. So you might always have wondered why famous stars and starlets through time said that they would go to a certain hotel to be able to enjoy the ambiance or to enjoy the food. Well, a lot of it was because some of the most high-end foods or food chains actually started kind of added on to different hotels. So you had hotels, hotel restaurants, and you have famous chefs that people would travel for. Now, after that, we started to get a lot of more food chains, right? Instead of it being just a series of Gordon Ramsay restaurants that are housed into different hotels, we started to see roadside restaurants. So in the mid 1900s, we had World War II, and then the highway system was implemented. So this is where Eisenhower came in and he said, hey, in times of warfare, we need to really be able to move things. So we need to have, one, have a place where we can land planes, and two, have a way that we would be able to very quickly move supplies in between towns and cities, right? So part of this came up with the highway system, or the interstate highway system. So before this, a lot of the time, major roadways were serviced by the state. Now major roadways had a interconnected system that was being mostly funded by the national government. Which ended up making it so that people, for the first time ever, could road trip across the US. They could go all the way from California to New Jersey to South Carolina to Texas. And this was one of the first times that this was really viable to do in a decent amount of time on well-maintained roads that went through major cities. With that, Americans took off on traveling. They love the idea of being able to just be able to drive places or have these expanded roadways. And that's where we started to see, instead of just this high-end culinary dining, we saw a huge rise of motels, roadside hotels, fast food restaurants, quick coffee shops, and a lot of these sort of McDonald's, Taco Bell-esque places arise during this time period. That again happened once we started to have the expansion of air travel. So air travel at first was not regulated as heavily by the federal government. So it was actually extremely expensive at first, to the point where only the most elite people could afford high-end air travel. So a lot of high-end restaurants and hotels would spring up nearby airports, because as airport travel was starting to take off for very affluent individuals, you started to need places to house them and places to feed them, right? Then you got to the point where we had a lot of the regulation and then deregulation of American Airlines. And at this point, we saw airline travel being much more affordable for individuals. So now we had tourist destinations, right? And that's where a lot of different sort of food things started to grow out of is, well, we have people visiting this area. How do we attract them? And by maybe the 1980s, we also got to the point that the baby boomers were beginning to exert economic power. So all the babies that were born after World War II were grown up. Not only were they grown up, they had successful jobs and they could start spending money. And this ended up leading to lots of different travel and basically an economic powerhouse of like more people able to spend money than we ever had at any other time period. So this led to people going to more distant and exotic destinations. This is where we saw the beginning of people really traveling for the purpose of wanting to see newer and cooler places. This is my cat. I'm sorry she will be in so many videos. She's very cute. Her name's Stormy. I love her. But yeah, she has no chill, and she's just going to jump in front of the camera. She has a broken tail. Thank you for dealing with it. So anyways, let's see. After the 20th century, we get to more of the 21st century. So, oh gosh, I got told the other day that I was born in the late 1900s, and I'm still dying from it. But anyways, the 1900s, the hospitality, or excuse me, the herbs, and now we're moving more towards the 2000s, right? So the 21st century, super duper cool. Everybody in my generation remembers where we were during Y2K and how that was going to be a big deal. We remember the dot-com burst, the other dot-com burst. We remember the Twin Towers. We remember, the financial crisis of 2008, which that's a whole line of stories in and of themselves. But in the 21st century, we're seeing a lot continue to mature when it comes to hospitality and tourism. I remember a time where if you tried to pay with a credit card, they would have a little machine that they'd pull out. They'd put your credit card down and like run back and forth over it to try to imprint on a carbon copy sheet. Today, you're able to just pay with your watch or your phone anywhere. You can travel basically anywhere you want. We have more market segmentation and consolidation, and everything's changing constantly. And it's so beautiful, but we're moving at a rate that we've never seen before with technology integration that we've never seen before. And with more people traveling, we start to see massive industry growth all over the world. So it used to be for a long time that people in the United States hardly ever left the United States, right? A majority of people would not take an international trip in their lifetime. That's not necessarily true anymore. I think about like 35% of people will leave the country at some point in their life. Many will do it more often than that. It's highly correlated with education. People who have a bachelor's degree are I think like 50% likely to actually leave the country at some point. And that's why other international tourist destinations have started to come up, and such as China, Brazil, India, other economic powerhouses. And this is why we started to think about hospitality not only as the mom and pop diner in your neighborhood, but we're starting to think about international venues and cooperation. And that is so cool. And then, of course, we've had COVID-19, right? And this forced rapid shifts because there were lots of hospitality companies that weren't quite ready for technology to move yet. But then all of a sudden they were forced to. They were forced to understand QR codes or online menus or making things accessible or being able to have virtual waiters or being able to have DoorDash and Grubhub in a volume that was never expected to happen at this time. This is also where we saw the rise of ghost kitchens. So different companies that end up renting out a common space or just extra space within an existing restaurant. So your Chili's might also have a pizza shop operating out of it. And those places also serving food, even though they don't have a physical location. We've seen a game changer in this timeline, and I just think it's so neat. So that's a lot of what we're going to be talking about because hospitality and tourism is very interrelated, right? It's both front of house and back of house, which if you've waited tables for as many years as I have in my life, you probably know what those words mean. Good on you. We can be friends. But there's lots of front of house interactions, right? Where you have direct contact with guests, where you make sure that they have their room, that they get their service, that they're able to do their travel plans, that they're getting the food and wine pairings that they would like. And there's also all the work behind the scenes, the operations, right? So not only is this your cooks and your chefs, these are your housekeepers. This is the technology that keeps stuff together. This is the managers. This is the sales representatives. And some of the most challenging aspects of working in the hospitality industry is creating powerful impressions by having good interrelated service in between this front and back of house. Oh, so let's talk a little bit about the industry. Hospitality, if you've waited tables before, if you've worked in hotels, if you've worked at amusement parks, if you've worked for airlines, you know that you work 365 days a year, 24 hours a day. The hospitality industry does not sleep, and there's never really a day off. Like, of course, you get your service industry nights, you get your Mondays and Tuesdays off. Your life might change a bit, but it's hardly ever a 40-hour-a-week job, and many positions are expected to work 10 to 12 hours across multiple shifts. The hospitality industry is in the business of providing guest satisfaction at a price and figuring out what that price is and what that level of satisfaction is. And hospitality, unlike other industries where banks may close for Christmas or New Year's or the schools might be closed for summer, hospitality, sometimes that's their busiest time of the year. That summer travel crowd, that holiday travel crowd, those Black Friday shoppers, right? So thinking about hospitality is so important when we're thinking about also how this is just a full service all the time environment. And there's lots of cool characteristics to that, right? So it's very difficult to talk about something when the product is intangible, because not only is the product kind of what we're selling them, right? You get to stay in room A for 4 days. Like, that's cool. But what you're really selling them is, and you have people to help you, and here's the check-in process, and we're providing you a good experience, and we're providing you good memories, and we're providing you an amusement park where you're going to have all these cool memories, and then you're going to get engaged, and you're going to bring your family here, or all these other sorts of things. The products that we have in hospitality are intangible in a way that you don't have in other industries. And it also explains why the product is also sort of perishable, right? A room that's not sold is money that you're not getting. A meal not sold, you can't really save it to the next day, right? So we say that this is more an inelastic supply. I'm an economist. Sorry, I have to sprinkle in my econ knowledge here and there. But this inelastic supply means that there's a set amount of things that can't necessarily be changed. We can't change the number of rooms in our hotel overnight. We can't change the number of meals that we have ordered supplies for. But what we can change temporarily is price or discounts. And these are things that we need to think about, right? No, hold on. I think there was more there. Guess not. Huh. Okie dokie. By the way, in case you're going through these slides and you're wanting to know more about it, you can either use the scroll wheel on your mouse to go back and forth, or there's these little arrows on the bottom part of your screen where you can go anywhere that you want to in the presentation. Well, that might be useful. All right, so let's think about the philosophy of hospitality, because I can teach someone math. I can teach someone to read and interpret Shakespeare. What I can't teach people is sometimes thinking about care and service. Right? So it used to be that there was this very corporate philosophy focused on like the manager's ability to plan, organize, and implement and measure performance. And it was all really based on the manager, and you just did that job. But today there's more of a shift towards managers are basically the counselors of the team, right? They're making sure that everybody has the resources that they need, and it is a teamwork environment. And that's hospitality across the board, where we need to think about managers as being able to, if you're a manager, provide resources to your team, give them the ability to succeed, help them to develop and think for themselves, help them to plan and project. So hospitality has really shifted from being a leader follower situation to more of a team group effort. And I like that. I think that's kind of neat. There's also this sort of spirit to serve, right? Service is a commitment to continuous improvements and overcoming obstacles, where you come in and you say, I would like to provide the best that I can, and I always want to be better than I was yesterday, and I'm not going to let things get in my way. And when they do, I'm going to find out how to address that. And that's sort of the spirit to serve, right? So this also means that we need to have consideration for many different things, such as sustainability and environments, or cultural competence, really understanding your customer and your employees and their background and their cares and their desires, and thinking about like what's important to them on a very base cultural level. So being able to understand cultural influences can really affect how we treat guests and associates and communities, because there might be different norms, and understanding hospitality is also knowing the norms of the area in which you are providing service. Sustainability is the idea of achieving ongoing economic prosperity while actively protecting natural resources and quality of life, right? So it's saying like, we're going to make economic prosperity better, but we're going to do it in a way where we don't deplete things. And this is something that we've been thinking about a lot in hospitality and tourism lately, is it's something that we're trying to heavily shift to. So there's lots of ways to measure success, right? The service industry is by far the largest sector of the US economy. That wasn't necessarily the case in the 1950s. In the 1950s, I think we were, what, 60% manufacturing, like 20% service, and like 20% agriculture. Today, we are less than 10% agriculture, 70% service, and actually very little in manufacturing. Most manufacturing has moved out of the US, though there's still many things that we produce ourselves. Corn syrup being one, different types of cars. But for the most part, we're a service-based economy. So one way to ensure success in service whether it be travel, whether it be lodging, whether it be anything in between. But one way to ensure success is to also ensure loyalty, that you have provided an experience that a guest wants to come back to, no matter what, whether it's in an amusement park or whether it's in, I don't know, a sailing company. So a guest is anyone who receives benefit from the output of someone else's work. And for success in service, it's necessary to focus on this guest and understanding the role of the guest contact employee. Who's working with that guest? How are they working with that guest? How are we promoting services that focus on culture and technology and consistency? Because consistency is key to being able to keep repeat business. There we go. So in the area of service, we say something called TQM. This is something that you're going to hear me repeat many times over this course, because TQM means total quality management. This just means that we're participating in a process that empowers all levels of employees to work, whether it be in groups, whether it's to establish guest service expectations. But TQM means that we are working in a way to actively give our employees the best that we possibly can, so that they are able to provide the best that they possibly can to guest services and to meet those expectations or even exceed those expectations. That's different from the rest of the business world. The rest of the business world, and I would know, I've been in an accounting department, I've been in a finance department, I've been in a business department, I've been everywhere. In every other field, it's really about quality control. It's about finding the bugs. It's about finding the errors and fixing them. Hospitality is one of the few things where we don't want the bug to happen. We don't want to figure out that someone had a bad time and then try to fix it later. We want to make sure that we are providing the best time up front. So in hospitality and tourism, it's more preemptive quality management as opposed to responsive quality management. And there's lots of careers in hospitality. So this is not necessarily a straight line. Most people who get into the service sector will change lots of things. You might work in a restaurant, and then you might decide to go work in sales for a car company. And then you might decide that you really care about amusement parks and you're going to go to design roller coasters and talk to donors who want to provide for those projects. And then maybe you might decide that you want to go run an airline. There's plenty of things that you can do in your life, and almost no one in hospitality has a straight point A to point B, because there's so many things that we can learn along the way. The path to being successful in hospitality typically deals a little bit with food and bev, room division, marketing, human resources, finances, and I know everybody hates this one because you take that intro to accounting class and you just have nightmares about it, but even a little bit of accounting, like that's really important to know the base of what are you working with. So progression from department to department earns you sort of experience to take that next step. And hospitality is one of those things where you're able to change your job pretty frequently. You're able to go in between different careers because it's your way of skill building, right? So that comes to the question, is hospitality for you? Well, there's lots of personal characteristics you need to be successful in hospitality. You know, honesty, not lying about the work that you do, and trying to work hard and being a team player. Those are really important pieces, because hospitality is very, very rarely a one-person show. It is a relationship-based environment, where a lot of the time, if you want to go be a manager somewhere, well, someone's going to call your previous manager, right? Or if you want to be able to lead a team, well, it's going to be based upon how you interact with different members of that team. So being a team player is really important. Being prepared for, unfortunately, working many holidays or long hours, and how to cope with stress, and making good decisions and communicating those decisions, and being dedicated to, at the end of the day, providing a good service. If that's what you want to do, then maybe hospitality is right for you. All right. So let's think about the topics that we're going to be going through this semester. I know it is a very fast-paced semester. We're about to go real fast. Next week, we're going to start on hotels and lodgings. Now, give yourself extra time next week, because this is the largest set of assignments. So the most time-intensive week that we have is actually going to be next week during hotels and lodging. Then the week after that, we're going to go to food and beverage, then tourism, the meeting, conventions, and expos. That's actually where I shine because I do a lot of it, so I'm pretty excited. And then after that, we're going to focus really in depth into the leadership and management component of how to be a manager. Because, you know, if you wanted to wait tables, you could just go wait tables. But if you want to be a manager, sometimes that's why you take classes like this, to be able to learn some of those skill sets, right? Okie dokie. Well, with that, you know what? I think we're going to have a great semester. I think that this is going to be a lot of fun. I'll see you soon.